Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Jennifer Hsu, Chairperson of Sustainable Ringwood's Green Team, and I'm delighted that you have joined us for our first presentation in a series on native plants and gardening for wildlife. I would like to thank the Ringwood Public Library for co-hosting this webinar. The Green Team really appreciates all the support that we have received from the library and its staff. This webinar will be followed by an in-person presentation at the Ringwood Public Library on April 13th by Deb Ellis, founder and leader of the Essex chapter of the Native Plant Society of New Jersey. And on June 1st, mark your calendars, we will have another in-person presentation at the library by Dawn Torino, president of the Bergen County Audubon Society. On that day, we will be celebrating the grand opening of our native plant garden adjacent to the library. So look for the announcements of these events and all of our festivities. You can register for these free events in the website of the Ringwood Public Library. This event and our presentation series is supported by a $10,000 grant through the Sustainable Jersey Grants Program funded by the PSE&G Foundation. And we are truly grateful for the support from Sustainable Jersey. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Douglas Tallamy. He is a T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture and Natural Resources in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, and he holds a joint faculty appointment in the Department of Biological Sciences. He is the author of several best-selling books, including Nature's Best Hope and Bringing Nature Home, and he has authored and co-authored 97 publications. He is also the recipient of several awards, including the Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation and the Tom Dodd Jr. Medal or Award for Excellence. We are indeed fortunate to have Dr. Tallamy as a speaker this evening. Welcome, Dr. Tallamy.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, we're going to talk about Homegrown National Park tonight, or at least my idea of what it should be. But before we do that, let me ask you if you know what this is. It looks like a fecal sac. You know, birds in their nest, they don't want their babies pooping in the nest, so they've evolved a little sac, and the babies put the poops in the sac, and the parents pick it up and fly out and drop it, and it goes splat on a leaf. It's called a fecal sac, and that's what this is supposed to look like. It's not a fecal sac. It's actually a spider. It's a bolus spider, and it sits on top of the leaf so that it looks like a fecal sac because nobody wants to eat a fecal sac. But at night, it hangs from the leaf and looks like a real spider, and it drops a single strand of silk with one sticky glob of glue at the end there, and it goes hunting. Now, you wouldn't think that anything would fly into a single target like that. You'd think a web would be a much better design. But they do. Moths fly in, she catches the moths, she spins them around very quickly and wraps them up, and then she has a nice meal. Then she cuts that body loose, and she'll go hunting again, catch another moth, then she catches another moth, and when she gets enough energy, she spins an elaborate egg case, fills it full of eggs, and that is how they overwinter in these egg cases. But she'll go hunting again, and if she gets enough energy, she'll make 2 or 3 egg cases. So the real question is, why are moths flying into this single target? It's not by accident. She's actually releasing the sex pheromone of particular species of moths. So all the moths that come in are males. They think she's a female. She is, but she's the wrong species. And that's the end of them. Well, I was interested in finding out what species of moth our bolus spiders at our house were catching. So I unwound the little bodies that she cut loose and found it was the bronze cutworm. And I've got bronze cutworm adult moths because I've got bronze cutworm caterpillars. And I've got bronze cutworm caterpillars because I've got goldenrod, their primary host plant. I've got this beautiful moth, the dot-lined white, on our property because I've got oak trees, primarily white oak trees, and they love white oak trees. And because I don't rake the leaves away from underneath those trees. There is a dot-lined white cocoon in this batch of leaves. And believe me, you would not see that when you're raking leaves. You probably don't see it right now. There it is right there. There it is enlarged, blends right in. So keep in mind, when you're raking your leaves away, throwing them all away, you're throwing away a lot of life forms. I have evening primrose moths because I planted evening primrose and the moth came. spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but another success. I have the zebra swallowtail because I planted pawpaws. That is the only host plant for that caterpillar that creates that beautiful butterfly. It would take me a long time, a week or more, talking continuously to describe all the species that now call our property home. It would not take me very long to describe the species that are using a typical residential landscape like this. There is no goldenrod, so there's no bronze cutworms, so there's no bola spiders. There are no oak trees, so there's no dotline whites. There's no evening primrose, so there's no evening primrose moth. There's no pawpaws, so there's no zebra swallowtails. As a matter of fact, there's very little that can live in a typical residential landscape, and we've got 135 million acres of typical residential landscapes in the U.S. And we're not through. We're continuing to develop 800,000 new acres of natural areas every year in the U.S. That's one of the reasons we're seeing some scary headlines on a regular clip now. The insect apocalypse is here, talking about global insect decline. North America has lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. As a matter of fact, 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is already gone. The UN's predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. 40% of Earth's plants face extinction. Very, very bad news, which is why Elizabeth Kolbert gets to write this book, The Sixth Extinction. You know, the Earth has experienced 5 great extinction events, which totally reordered life on planet Earth. And we are now in the 6th one, but this is the first one to be caused by a living organism. And that, of course, is us. Now, people are upset about this. And more people hear about that. They're upset, so much so that scientists are actually studying what our response to the loss of biodiversity is. And Richard Hobbs thinks it's very similar to the 5 stages of grief that we experience when we hear that we have a terminal disease. Typically, first we have denial. Well, no, we don't have a problem at all. And you certainly hear that every day. Anger. I feel that sometimes. Bargaining. Wow, what can we do? Yeah. Depression. We have to fight that. Stage 5 is acceptance. And this is where we have to push back, because acceptance is the same thing as giving up. And giving up's not an option. We cannot give up on nature because it is nature that keeps us alive on this planet. So I'm going to propose a 6th stage, and that is action. We really can do something about it. Now, we do have parks. We have preserves. We've got the beautiful national park system. They were established primarily because they were beautiful. They're exquisite scenery. As a matter of fact, Teddy Roosevelt, who had a lot to do with expanding the National Park Service, said this about that. He said, the establishment of the National Park Service is justified by considerations of good administration. So Teddy was patting himself on the back, as he should, of the value of natural beauty as a national asset, and of the effectiveness of outdoor life and recreation in the production of good citizenship. In other words, our parks are there because they are pretty places for us to play in. They were not established with conservation in mind. And that's one of the reasons we only have 3.6% of the U.S. in the national park system. Only 12% is federally protected. If we compare that to Costa Rica, and I always forget the statistic, but it's 23 or 24% of Costa Rica is in national parks. So we lag way behind many other countries in terms of preservation. But people wonder, why aren't the parks and the preserves that we have enough to sustain the biodiversity that we need? It's a good question, and there actually are several reasons. But the biggest one is that they're too small. Those parks and preserves are too small. When you take a large area like this and you shrink it down into a little habitat patch, this is an exaggeration. You're taking a large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And that's the problem. Small populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why is that? Well, all populations fluctuate. Good times they go up and bad times they go down. If you're a large population, that's this top line here, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals that you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a small population, this bottom line here, and those normal fluctuations, you often hit 0. You blink out of your little habitat patch, and then you're gone. And unless you recolonize that patch, you're permanently gone. And it's getting harder and harder to recolonize our habitat patches these days. Picture a box turtle crossing Route 95. Just doesn't happen. So we've got studies all over the world, some of them quite long, over 100 years in length, that are saying the same thing. We have not preserved enough nature on planet Earth to sustain the amount of functioning ecosystems that we need to sustain ourselves. Now, we tend to use extinction as a metric of trouble. I don't like that because that's like going to the doctor once you're dead. It's a little late to be worrying about it. I think the real indication that we have a problem is defaunation, the reduction of species that were once the dominant species in an ecosystem that actually ran that ecosystem. And this is one of them, the American chestnut. It was the dominant tree in our forests along the Appalachian Crest from Maine all the way down to Georgia. And of course, we took it out with the chestnut blight. It's not extinct. There's still chestnut roots out there coming up, a few trees here and there, but it is functionally extinct. It is no longer performing its roles in its ecosystem. This is the rusty patch bumblebee. Used to be, not long ago, was one of the most common bees in the entire country. Now, if you find a rusty patch bumblebee, it's a big deal because they are on the brink of extinction. So again, not gone, but functionally gone. They're no longer performing their roles in their ecosystems. The American beaver, again, not extinct. As a matter of fact, it's coming back in a few places. But when the Europeans came there, beavers had established the hydrology of the entire country. And then we trapped just about all of them out and changed the hydrology of the entire country. And the hydrology of the entire country remains changed at this point. The beavers that are trying to come back, every time they act like a beaver, we trap them and take them away and make sure that they don't. So we're really talking about defaunation, the reduction in the abundance of species that run ecosystems. That is the real problem. It is local, it's everywhere, and we tend not to even notice it. Why not? Because of a phenomenon called shifting baseline. We tend to think that the way things were when we were kids is the way they've always been and the way they should be. We enter a world, if we enter a world that's been defaunated, if we enter a neighborhood with very few birds singing, nothing else alive, no insects, we think that's normal. None of us miss the passenger pigeon, which was the most numerous bird on the planet, because it was extinct before any of us were born. So shifting baseline means that we're losing biodiversity, the biodiversity that sustains us, and we don't even notice it. Edward Way Teal, years ago, said, "We cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves." This is such common sense. It is such common sense. So what are we going to do? How are we going to fix this? There is some good news. The UN has recognized that we actually have two problems on the planet. We've got climate change, but we also have a biodiversity crisis. They met last year in Montreal, have a big conference to see what we can do about the biodiversity crisis. This is a headline that came out of that meeting. Crucial negotiations to protect biodiversity are moving at a snail's pace. We are negotiating whether or not we should protect the natural systems that allow us to inhabit planet Earth. It's incredible. Well, I don't know. I don't actually know what happened with that meeting. I guess they made a few resolutions. Doesn't mean much to me because we have never met one of the UN's resolutions. So I'm not counting on the UN to solve the problem. How about E.O. Wilson, famous professor at Harvard, the late E.O. Wilson? He died the day after Christmas 2 years ago. He was concerned about biodiversity loss his entire career, worked very hard to save it, not because he loved it, he did, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature, we're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Now, to a conservation biologist, that is good news. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are in trouble can be in that half. We humans can be in the other half, and it will be great. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. I don't see that diminishing very quickly. And we've got 8 billion people, along with all of our hardscape, all of our roadways and airports and detritus in the other half. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? Well, I think we can. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I think we can, but we need a new approach to conservation to do that. We've got to give up the idea, the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That's an ancient idea. We followed that for centuries, but we've got to give it up. Not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. So we're not just going to practice conservation here. We're going to practice it over here too, but it's gone. There's nothing to conserve here. So we have to move beyond conservation into restoration. We have to rebuild ecosystem function where we live, where we work, where we play. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. So here's the basic problem: fragmentation. We've taken viable habitats and shrunk them to little teeny pieces of their former selves, and they're isolated from each other. So, of course, the populations within those little fragments are tiny, and when they fluctuate, they tend to disappear. So the solution that's been suggested, of course, is to make biological corridors, little connecting ways so that plants and animals can move back and forth between viable habitats. And if they do that, that will reduce the pressure from inbreeding, which is good. But look, the populations are still tiny. So when they fluctuate, they will still disappear. I think we've got to go beyond biological corridors. We've got to build viable habitat in between those viable habitats. We've got to, this is no man's land right now. We've got to put the plants back and make it habitable. This is good. This is even better. Now, the light areas here would be where our cities are and much of our agriculture. What is this area here? It's our private property. It's where we live, which means we've got to come up with a new attitude about property rights. We have this idea that we have the right to do whatever we want with that little piece of the earth that we say we own. But we're not thinking. Our yards are not like Las Vegas. You know that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but what happens on our yards does not stay on our yards, does not stay in our properties. Our properties are part of local ecosystems. So whatever we do to our property impacts that entire ecosystem for good or for bad. Let's talk about what happens if you have a big lawn. The amount of lawn you have is going to determine whether rain infiltrates when it rains or whether it leaves as stormwater runoff. It's going to determine whether we're polluting our local watershed. Are we adding nitrogen, phosphorus, herbicides, and insecticides to that watershed? Because that's all the stuff we put on our lawns. Are we adding carbon to the air every time we mow these big lawns? The amount of lawn we have is going to determine whether or not we're supporting pollinators, because lawn, at least the way we are told we're supposed to maintain it, doesn't support pollinators at all. The plants we put on our property, including that lawn, are going to determine whether we're actually storing carbon, whether we're pulling it out of the atmosphere and then using that carbon to build the tissues of the plants on our property. And of course, all plants are pumping carbon into the atmosphere or into the soil through their root systems. When they have big root systems. Lawn does not have a big root system. The plants we choose for our landscapes are going to determine whether we're harboring ecological tumors like Callery pear, Bradford pear, which of course don't stay on our property, escape and become major invasive species that push out the native plants that do support our ecosystems. It's also going to determine how well we're supporting the food web. Are we choosing the plants that actually pass on part of their energy so that you have insects, so that you have birds and everything else? So how we landscape, how much lawn we have, and what our plant choices are going to determine how much life Earth can sustain, or at least the Earth around us. In other words, it's going to determine the carrying capacity of the ecosystems around us. That is an awesome responsibility. And it's an awesome responsibility that most homeowners do not know they have. But it also creates a grassroots solution to the biodiversity crisis. There are millions of us. There are hundreds of millions of us. And if each one of us became the future of conservation, we really could tackle these issues. So where are we going to do it? We're going to start on private property. Most of the country, particularly the lower 48 states, is privately owned. 78% of the entire country privately owned. 85.6% of the country east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So if we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Collectively, that makes property owners the hope and the future of conservation. And again, this will work, but only if they realize that conservation is one of their responsibilities. Let's return to lawn and talk about what we can do about it. It is the low-hanging fruit on our properties, and we got a lot of it. The last figure I saw was 44 million acres of lawn in this country, which is bigger than the all of New England combined. Why are we doing that? Well, it's a status symbol. It's a status symbol dedicated to an ecological deadscape. And we have to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we reduce the area? Let's cut that area of lawn in half. We're not going to get rid of lawn. It's a wonderful cue for care, a good place to walk. We can play baseball on it, but we're going to cut the area of lawn in half. That will give us enough area so that we can create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. We'll make the math simple. We'll say we've got 40 million acres of lawn. We're going to cut that in half. That'll give us 20 million acres that we can put towards Homegrown National Park. How big is that? It's bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. Well, we've actually formed a small nonprofit that we call homegrownnationalpark.org. You can join it. All you have to do is register the location of your property and the amount of your property you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to reduce the lawn a little bit. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Whatever you do is good news. Then your little piece of your county is going to light up with a firefly. And you get to see how many other people in your county have joined Homegrown National Park. The object, of course, is to use social media to get the message that everybody is responsible for good earth stewardship. We want that message to go viral. Our mission is to motivate millions of people to regenerate biodiversity by planting the native plants that support that diversity, removing the invasive species that do not support that diversity, and in essence, reshaping our relationship with nature. Here are that's the distribution of the existing national parks. We want to turn this into that. Shouldn't be that hard. So what are we asking? We really do want to reduce the area that's in lawn. Lawn doesn't accomplish any of the ecological goals that our landscapes have. Replace it with plants, the native plants that do accomplish those goals. Remove invasive species from our properties. Most people have invasive plants on their property and they don't even know it. And if we're protecting any natural areas, we want to continue to do that. There are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park, a significant increase in biodiversity, and I'll give you some examples of that in a few minutes. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody got rid of the invasive plants just on their property, we'd be 78% done in the entire country. We'd be 85% done in the East. That is a good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst plant for sequestering carbon dioxide. So if you replace it with a planting like this or just about anything else, you're going to help climate change. And we're going to start to build viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Any bit of conservation we do outside of a park helps conservation inside of the park. But equally important are the sociological products associated with Homegrown National Park. National awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We want to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not there just for us to play in. It's essential. It's essential for everybody, which means everybody owns responsibility to sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge all of the existing conservation organizations. So Audubon and National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones and Sierra Club and all the land conservancies doing wonderful conservation on private property, but it's not being recorded in any coordinated way. And that's what we want our biodiversity map to do. Remember, we've got a 30 by 30 initiative. We're going to save 30% of the US by 2030. Not if we don't record conservation on private property. If we're going to take areas like this and turn them into that, we have to take areas like this and turn it into that. It doesn't mean we're going to leave. We're going to start to coexist with nature. Now, Homegrown National Park is free. There's no charge at all. We are entirely supported by your generosity. So thank you very much. There's urgency in enacting the Homegrown National Park solution. Remember that 135 million acres in residential landscapes? That's a big job. So we all need to get to work, but we have to understand what it is we're supposed to do at home. What do we need to know to succeed? Well, there's 4 things. I said earlier, there's 4 things that every landscape has to do if we're going to reach a sustainable relationship with Mother Nature. Every landscape has to support a viable food web. If you don't have a food web, you don't have any animals. If you don't have the animals, you don't have a functioning ecosystem. Every landscape has to sequester carbon, store carbon, pull it out of the atmosphere and store it in plants and in the ground. Every landscape has to manage the watershed in which it lies. This is my neighbor, and he's wrecking my watershed. He doesn't know it, but he is. Does he have the ethical right to do that? I would say no. Every landscape has to support pollinators. Lawn does none of those things. And that's why we focus on, at least in the beginning, we're going to focus on reducing the area of lawn. We also have to focus on that plant choice. Plant choice is so important. This, of course, is burning bush, a major invasive species. There are 3 types of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs. Remember, plants are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning into the food that supports the animals. If you don't pass that food on, if you don't pass the energy on, you don't have functional ecosystems. So there's plants that are good at doing that. There's plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs. And there's plants that actually remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor across the country, in 84% of the counties in which it occurs, is one of the oaks. Oaks are contributing more energy to local food webs than any other type of plant by far. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo biloba. From Asia. It's a good ornamental tree, a nice fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo, which means it's not adding any energy to local food webs. And a good example of a detractor would be any of the invasive plants. Here's this bamboo, but we got a bunch of them that escape our properties. Not only are they not adding energy to local food webs, but they're pushing out the native plants that do. They're pushing out the contributors. So they're removing energy from local food webs. We have to build a new appreciation for how important caterpillars are in local food webs. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. And that's why keystone plants are so important, because they support the most caterpillars. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. If you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants and the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that support that house. They are the support system. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do with our ornamental plants for the last century. How do you know what the best plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the best woody plants and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. This is abbreviated. I just ran out of room. So the old excuse of, I don't know what to plant, is just an excuse now. You do know what to plant. Go to Native Plant Finder, and they pop up for you. We have to think very, very carefully about what E.O. Wilson told us. He told us a lot of things, and they turn out to be really important, like insects are the little things that run the world. Life as we know it depends on insects, and it would change dramatically in a negative way if they were to disappear. So maybe we should stop killing all our insects. And we should also recognize that 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. So if we're designing landscapes that are going to keep those insects in our ecosystems, we have to choose the plants that those insects eat. They can only eat the ones for which they have very specialized adaptations that allow them to get around the defenses, the chemical defenses that all plants have. Let's talk about the monarch butterfly as a perfect example. We already know about what the monarch is eating. Most people know that the monarch is a host plant specialist on milkweed. You can have all the burning bush and all the calorie pear and all the privet and all the hostas and all the ginkgos and all the things we landscape with in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. And you probably know that milkweeds are toxic plants. They're filled with cardiac glycosides and sticky latex sap. When you break open a leaf, all this white goo comes out. When that's exposed to air, that gels. It becomes like chewing gum. And if it gets on a caterpillar's mouth parts, it glues his mouth shut. And then it starves to death. So it's a very effective defense. Yet monarchs eat milkweeds. How do they do that? Well, they've got the specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify cardiac glycosides. They snip the petiole or the midrib of the leaves they're going to eat before they eat it, and it blocks the flow of sticky latex sap. So the monarch can actually eat milkweed without getting his mouth parts gummed up. Very specialized adaptations that allow monarchs to take advantage of that particular plant when most other insects can't. But the point I want to make is that monarchs are not special. 90% of the insects that are out there have very specialized relationships with particular plants that are just like the monarch. We need to have those native plants or we lose 90% of our insects. We also have to make it common knowledge that we need pollinators. Not just that we need them. We're pretty good at that. We've been trying to save the honeybee and other pollinators for the last several years now. But we have this idea that we only need pollinators in agriculture. That's what the media says. You know, they pollinate a third of our crops. We need pollinators, but we need them everywhere, not just in agriculture, because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. So losing our pollinators is not an option. We have to appreciate how important leaves are, fallen leaves are on our landscapes. We call them leaf litter. Maybe they're leaf largesse. That's what somebody in St. Louis suggests. They do wonderful things for us. Of course, the nutrients that our trees use that year are locked up in these leaves. If we don't get those nutrients back into the soil, if we rake our leaves away, we're starving our plants year after year after year. So returning nutrients to the soil is one of the important things that they do. Forming a blanket over our soil community. Everything in the soil requires high humidity. And there are more species that live in the soil than above the soil, including those mycorrhizal fungi associations that transfer the nutrients from the soil into our plant tissues. All of the organisms that break down those leaves. It's a vibrant community, but it all depends on high humidity, and that's what the leaves accomplish. And then, of course, there's lots of things that live in those leaves. Now, the reason we rake our leaves away is because we think if we don't, our plants won't be able to grow. Well, who was raking the leaves before we got here? And believe me, we had plants in North America. So they must be able to get through normal layers of leaf litter. If you pile them 5 feet thick, yes, that's going to smother them. But normal layers work just fine. This is golden seal. It does just fine getting through our leaf litter. This is a white snake root at my house. I didn't plant any of it, and I didn't rake the leaves away. It's just a natural community that came in. I'm showing you this picture to remind you that ground covers don't have to be 2 inches high. These guys are, 3 or 4 feet high, and they are still considered ground covers, growing just fine through those leaves. We have to start to recognize that light pollution kills insects, particularly those moths that are making the caterpillars that run our food web. Now, in this case, we've got good news. There are a lot of lights out there. And it's easy to turn them off, but I know we don't like to do that. But if you take out the white bulb and put in a yellow bulb, you have succeeded because yellow wavelengths do not attract nocturnal insects. So here we have a very easy, cheap solution. You can go to the hardware store and buy what's called a bug light. They also sell them in LEDs. So remember, yellow wavelengths don't kill nocturnal insects. If we were to switch out our white lights for yellow lights overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars too. And we have to think about whether or not we really need to do all that mosquito fogging. This is a booming business around the country. And the mosquito foggers say it is okay because this is a natural product. It's organic, and they are correct. It is a natural product. It's made by chrysanthemums. That means it's organic, but cyanide is a natural organic product. Ricin is a natural organic product. Nicotine is a natural organic product. So being natural organic doesn't mean it's not toxic. They also say it only kills mosquitoes, and that's not even close to being true. This is the result of a mosquito fogging event on Kent Island in the Chesapeake. a few years ago, my friend happened to be there. He picked up a handful of dead monarchs after the mosquito fogger left, but there were thousands of dead monarchs on the ground. He caught them as they were migrating. And let me remind you, the monarch population this year down in Mexico is the second smallest it has ever been. The monarch is on the brink because of events like this. The interesting thing is mosquito fogging, it's an ironic thing, does not control mosquitoes. We're doing this for nothing. Actually, we're paying good money to do it for nothing. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. And these guys kill between 10 and 50%. So you control mosquitoes in the larval stage. And homeowners can do it quite easily. You get a bucket and you fill it full of water and you put in a handful of straw or hay or dead leaves. Let the population of diatoms and algae build up, which it will. Then you go to the hardware store and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks. $12 for a season's worth of control. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. This is biological control. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera, and the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So yeah, put one of those in there after the mosquitoes lay their eggs, which, by the way, they will, because this becomes an irresistible brew to female mosquitoes. They want to put their eggs where all that larval food is. And that's how we control mosquitoes in a targeted, cheap way without killing anything else. We have to start to appreciate that we have to do conservation in cities as well. 82% of us live in cities. 82% of us have small or tiny populations, or small or tiny properties. This is Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. It's 1/10 of an acre, 100% native plants, 125 bird species use it. So conservation works wherever you do it. And if you have no property, it still works. This is where you use container gardening. And there's a new feature on our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, all about container gardening. You can go to that feature and look at the best plants for containers in your ecoregion. And these are very good for pollinators, for migrating monarchs, even if it's on the 5th floor or on the roof, because they're very mobile creatures. They find it. Now, fortunately, we do have a silver bullet in our fight against climate change and biodiversity crisis, 2 crises on the planet Earth, and we can fight them together. And that is that conservation works. This is the Nachusa grasslands in Illinois, 3,800 acres, more than 730 plant species there now. 180 species of birds have been recorded there. It used to be a cornfield. Nature is resilient. Nature excuse me, repairs itself when we give it half a chance. It's where I live. It's where my wife and I live in Oxford, Pennsylvania. It's what our house looked like just before we moved in. There was a farm, a very old farm, about 300 years old, that broke up, sold into 10-acre lots, and we got one of those lots. Just before they broke it up, they mowed it for hay. Now, when you mow for hay in Southeast Pennsylvania, you are really mowing the rootstocks of all the invasive plants that are in our woods. And that is multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and autumn olive and miscanthus and porcelain berry, and all those guys are there. So when you stop mowing, that's what comes back. And that's what our 10 acres looked like when we actually moved in. It was a giant tangle of Asian plants. So the first thing you have to do in a conservation effort is get rid of that. And it can be daunting. It looks daunting. It is not as hard to get rid of them as you think. You just get your wife to do it. And then it looks like that. So Cindy did do it. Now, you know, doesn't happen overnight. She likes doing it. And I was very lucky about that. But this is what our house looks like in the summertime today, taken from pretty much the same place I took that first picture. We put a lot of the plants back. Not all of them, still working on it. But now, one of the things that my research has shown over the last 20 years is that if you know the number of species of moths in your local food web, moths, not butterflies. Butterflies are bad-tasting, day-flying moths. And because they don't taste very good, they're not an important part of the local food web. So we focus on moths. If you know the number of species of moths, you have a good index of how stable that food web is and how productive it is. How many other species is it supporting? So 6 years ago, I started taking a picture of every species of moth that occurs on our property. I am still at it. but I'm up to 1,259 species of moths so far, making a living here. Why? Because we put the plants back. And many of these are very interesting creatures, like the chinkapin leaf miner, the skullcap skeletonizer, the neighbor. They've got great names. The little devil, the horrid zale, the forgotten frigid owlet. What a great name that is. The visitation moth, the obtuse yellow, the explicit arches, the snowy shouldered eclaris, the grateful midget, the morbid owlet, the pink shaded fern moth, the feeble grass moth, the scribbler, the lemon plagotis, the cynical quaker, the showy emerald, the green marvel, Harris's three spot, the old wife underwing, the eyed pectes, the hog sphinx, the tufted bird dropping moth. Who wouldn't want the tufted bird dropping moth? And my favorite, the spun glass caterpillar. Hundreds of other species of moths are now making a living in our house because we put the plants back. And the first thing I hear is, well, they're going to eat all your plants. There are little mounds there, and they are eating a lot of plant material, but there's an awful lot of things that are eating them, like birds. You know, birds are eating, particularly when they're reproducing, hundreds of caterpillars a day per bird species, per bird individual, I should say. And you know, when you have a lot of birds, you wonder why you find any caterpillars at all. And we have recorded 62 species of birds that breed on our property. Look what they're feeding their babies. They're feeding them caterpillars hundreds a day. We also have other predatory insects or predatory insects like the ambush bug, the assassin bug, the predatory stink bug. This guy sat next to this aggregation of milkweed tussock moths, and he ate one every time he got hungry. And it really was a smaller aggregation by the time he got through. We've got a lot of hymenopteran parasitoids, most of which are attacking caterpillars. We've got a lot of wasps that are directly attacking them. They sting a caterpillar and paralyze it. And then they carry it off, put it in their little mud house, and lay an egg on it. This is nature's form of refrigeration. If they killed the caterpillar and took it away and laid an egg on it, it would rot before the egg even hatched. But if they paralyze it, it stays nice and fresh. The egg hatches and then can eat a fresh morsel. We have typical vertebrates that eat a lot of insects, like skunks, like possums, like raccoons, like foxes. 25% of a fox's diet is insects. And of course, we have amphibians. These are tree frogs. Good population of tree frogs and toads, salamanders, ringneck snakes, cutest little gray tree frogs, and they're green when they're little that you've ever seen. So we've got a whole bunch of higher trophic levels controlling the insects on our property. But our lawn goals are too modest. We have to think beyond the lawn. We're going to start there, but we have to think beyond it. And that's because most of the property is actually in privately owned woodlots, cropland, and rangeland. So let's talk briefly about each one of those. 406 million acres of woodlots in this country that are managed by private citizens, not logging companies in the U.S. Managed for what? Managed for lumber. Well, there's good ways to do that, and there's not so good ways to do that. And you also have to manage the invasive species that are in those woodlots to determine the biodiversity value of those spaces. We do have organizations like the Foundation for Sustainable Forests in Western Pennsylvania that are telling us how we can sustainably harvest our woodlot forever. There's two kinds of harvesting. There's high-grade harvesting, where you take the very best trees and leave the rest, and you get a great harvest once. And there's worst first selection, where you take smaller, more frequent harvests. You're taking the not-so-good trees, leaving the best trees, and that leads to higher yields indefinitely over time. But if you don't manage the invasive species that are in your woodlot, it's still going to have low biodiversity value. Excuse me. You are looking at White Clay Creek State Park, park down the road from me. And all the green you see is a plant from, or different plants, invasive species from Asia. They leaf out before plants from North America. So early spring, March, that's the time to look at your invasive species load in your, quote, natural areas. Third of the vegetation in our parks, on average, is our multiflora rose and autumn olive and all those guys. Why do we have such a bad invasive species problem? Yes, we brought these plants in. Most of them as ornamentals. Yes, they've escaped. But here are the guys that are really driving that system. We got way too many deer. We've got overabundance of deer. The deer eat the native plants and they do not eat the non-natives. That's a bit of a generalization, but not much. So they tip the competitive balance against our natives. And it's caused serious management issues. This is what a healthy forest looks like. That's the Great Smoky Mountains. I went down to the Great Smoky Mountains last spring, and the first thing I saw was understory. And I said, wow, how are you managing your deer? And they said, we're not managing our deer. I said, well, why do you have understory? And he said, well, we've got black bears and we've got uh, bobcats and we've got coyotes, and they are managing our deer. These, an understory, healthy understory is mostly the young canopy trees that are waiting for the big guys to die, and then they grow up and replace them. It's a very stable system. This is what a typical woodlot looks like where I live. No understory at all. This is Japanese stilt grass. The deer, anything that pops up here, like a young oak tree that they like, they will eat it. And you essentially have the collapse of forest regeneration. You also, of course, have the serious problem of Lyme disease. We've increased our deer population to the point where we've increased the deer tick population, and then we've got the disease cycle. I've had Lyme disease 5 times. I am not minimizing it, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but we have 3 options in controlling our deer, getting them back down below the carrying capacity. Where I live, we've got about 140 deer per square mile. We should have about 10. So way over the carrying capacity. You could bring the predators back, as has happened in the Great Smoky Mountains. That can be hard in suburbia. Hire sharpshooters, and some neighborhoods are doing that. They usually take out about 1/3 of the deer. And if they did that regularly, several times a year, every year, it would work. Very expensive. They usually do it once every 2 or 3 years, so not nearly enough. Bern Blassie at Cornell suggests market hunting, where you actually get paid to hunt deer and you do it all year long. Now, that is what controlled the bison. Remember those buffalo, those pesky guys out there? Took care of them. The passenger pigeon, even though it was the most common bird on the planet, we took care of them. The Carolina parakeet. Market hunting can take care of anything. So regulated, it could be the solution to too many deer. What do we do in the meantime? You got to protect the plants that you want. And this is what I had to do. I had to put a cage around any of the trees that I wanted because the deer would eat them. What about cropland? Got a lot of cropland too, 410 million acres of cropland, all the light green area in the U.S. And people think, well, there's not much you can do to cropland to increase its biodiversity value, but that is not true. There are 4 things we can do to greatly increase its biodiversity value. Manage the roadsides appropriately, put the hedgerows back every place we can, add prairie strips, and limit neonicotinoid insecticides. The monarch is in trouble, lost well over 90% of its population because we have taken the milkweeds out from the sides of the roads. We've taken the goldenrod out, the asters, the New York ironweed, all of the weeds that the monarch and our native bees use or used to use, and replaced it with lawn that we have to mow, which adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And we did it for aesthetics. We did it because it's a status symbol, not a good reason. But guess what? We can put it back, and people are doing it. They're doing it in Iowa. They're doing it wherever you've got responsible growers. They're actually putting the prairie systems back. And it's not just prairie plants. All the way to the east, we've replaced the roadsides with lawn. So we've got to put those plants back. In 1976, it was the highest monarch population ever recorded. And believe me, there was agriculture in the Midwest in 1976. So monarchs and agriculture and native bees and all the other things can coexist if we put the plants back. And put those hedgerows back too. And not single species of invasives like autumn olive, but multi-species native hedgerow. We took the hedgerows out because we have giant machines and it made it a little bit more convenient, but we took them out everywhere instead of just where it was hard for the machines. We can put them back and harbor a lot of biodiversity. And then finally, prairie strips. Great idea. Fantastic idea. Put these big, thick strips of prairie plants right through the corn, right through the soybeans, perpendicular to the flow of water off the landscape. Not only is it great for pollinators, but it reduces topsoil loss by 95%. water pollution by 90%. It absorbs, intercepts all of those nutrients before they leave the landscape. And it's supported by USDA CREP programs. So the farmer is getting paid to do this. It's a win-win for everybody. And then finally, limit the use of neonicotinoids, particularly seed coatings. You know, it's very hard to buy corn or soybeans or anything else out there that isn't coated with neonicotinoids, which are 7,000 times more toxic to insects than DDT was. They're used preventively. So whether or not you have an insect problem, you get a seed coating. And only 5% of the neonicotinoid is taken up by the plant. The other 95% washes off into the waterway, into the watershed, or blows away as dust, and we don't even know what it's doing. The interesting thing is when you compare yield in a field with seed coatings and a field with no seed coatings, there is no increase in yield. So it's another thing we are doing because the seed companies tell us we should do it, not because it actually benefits anybody. All right, rangeland. 770 million acres of rangeland. It's the biggest use of land in this country, 4.5 times the size of Texas dedicated to cattle, but it does not have to be an ecological disaster. Our grasslands around the world co-evolved with grazers. That's why grass became grass. The meristem is down at the base where the grazers can't get it. This is an experimental range in Nebraska that Cindy and I visited. These yellow things are sunflowers. These are cows. They're not bison. So everything was there. All of the grassland birds were there. The prairie was diverse. It was a wonderful system because it was not overgrazed. So we know how to limit the amount of grazing. And also putting beavers back. You don't think about that, particularly in the Southwest. All the beavers were trapped out, and when they were, their dams disappeared. And then when you had big rains, all of the streams became incised, in-cut. And it dropped the water table, removed the wetlands, so that it became extremely easy to overgraze those really dry areas. If you put the beavers back or put beaver analog dams back, it raises the water table back up, returns the wetlands even to the Southwest, and makes it very productive. Also makes it an area where the cottonwoods and the willows can grow, and that's where most of your biodiversity is if you keep the cows out of the stream. You've got to fence them out because they eat the cottonwoods and the willows, and then you end up with trampled stream beds. All of those things are doable, and there's something that's common to each one of those approaches to conservation, and that is whether or not they succeed depends on the decisions that you and I make, the decisions that people make. I had a student in one of my classes a few years ago, Amanda Crandall, who wrote this on her final exam. While conservationists claim to be managing species and habitats, what they're really managing is people. These are sociological issues. We need to change our adversarial relationship with nature to a collaborative one. And the question is, can we do this? Well, I think we certainly can do it. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live, and if you do, it empowers you. More and more people today are aware of the fact that the earth has some serious environmental issues, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can modify your lights, one person can add a pollinator garden, one person can remove invasive plants, one person can use keystone plants, one person can fire Mosquito Joe, one person can join Homegrown National Park. Whole bunch of things one person can do to revitalize the ecosystem on their property and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You will get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can manage. The piece of the earth where you can see the results. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as they volunteer. So I hope that Homegrown National Park will provide the motivation and the guidance for millions of people to tackle these conservation challenges. Whether or not we do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. I want to leave you with the Homegrown National Park Challenge. I'm going to ask each one of you to plant one keystone plant this year. It'll take you 5 minutes. Very easy thing to do. And you might say, well, that's not going to help very much. Well, I want 400,000 of you to do it. So you can contribute to that. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Well, I think that was a truly inspiring talk, and I thank you so much. And now Mary Ellen will read some of the questions that have come in.
Okay.
Yep, I'm pulling them up. Give me 1 second. And if anybody has questions, please put them in the chat, and then we'll read them out, and Dr. Tallamy will answer them for us. All right, so Shirley asks, I'd be interested in the process that Cindy used to eliminate the invasives, e.g. how to handle the roots from regrowing prior to planting native plants in their place.
Cindy won't use herbicides. So she does a lot of whacking. Now, I say she got rid of most of them. I helped in the beginning with some of the big guys. We wrapped a chain around the base of some of the big multiflora and pulled them out with a small tractor. But there were times where I do saw the trunk of the bigger, like autumn olive, and paint it with an herbicide. If you don't kill the root systems, it will just keep coming back and back and back. And early on, I realized I'm not going to live long enough to deal with that. So particularly things like Oriental bittersweet, if you don't kill that root system, it will come up forever. And it's a giant root system. When we moved into our house, we had Oriental bittersweets this fat. I ran out and I sawed them off and I didn't do anything with them. This is 23 years later. They're still coming up from that rootstock that I didn't kill that one day. So there's a time I think herbicides are an important tool in our toolbox, but you have to use them the way they're designed. Don't misuse them. But if you don't kill the rootstocks, they're going to come back forever. So Cindy has a hand whacker and she goes around. So, the ones that come in now are all tiny. She can get rid of those very easily. And by the way, right now is a very good time to go out and pull invasives because the ground is really loose from thawing and freezing. You can pull sizable multiflora rows out and other things just without whacking anything. Just give them a big tug and out they come.
Okay, then the next question is, when you planted natives, did you do it from seed, plugs, or full-grown plants? With that large a property, how did you manage costs in the purchase of the native plants?
We spent about $200 in the last 23 years, and it mostly was one day. There was a small nursery in New Jersey that went out of business. We drove over and we bought a bunch of beech trees that they were selling. So I did plant a lot of oak trees and I planted them from acorns. So that's seed. They were free. But you know who helped me? The Blue Jays helped me. They brought in beech seeds and in acorns and planted them. So the squirrels helped. The wind helped. It's amazing. We repopulated the 10 acres mostly with a process that Rick Dark calls addition by subtraction. We spent most of our time removing the things we didn't want, and the things we did want came in on their own. There's a seed bank there too. We have orchids in places that are coming up that have been there for who knows how long. And as soon as we cage the deer out of certain places, they come back. So the seed bank is very rich, and you don't have to spend a lot of money on it. You really don't. You have to be patient because little guys are little in the beginning. And if you protect them from the deer, though, they grow pretty quickly. Right now, I do most of my gardening with a chainsaw. As a matter of fact, we heat the entire year with the trees. Black cherry tree, black cherry throws a lot of seeds and it comes up everywhere. Very important plant, but I'm heating with the plants that are now crowding out. I'm losing my light in places because so many plants come in.
How do you manage deer from eating your new native plantings?
I have to cage it. The first year, we went to both Home Depot and Lowe's, and they sell these it's galvanized wire cages or wire about 5 feet tall in big rolls. So I cut strips off so that I could make a round cage that was maybe 4, sometimes even 5 feet in diameter. You don't want to crowd the plant, and then you put it over your little plant. The deer can't get to them, and I stake it with rebar. I am still using those cages 23 years later. So it's a little bit of money in the beginning, not that much, but they last forever. And you can move them around. When a plant gets past the point where the deer can hurt them, I call it graduation day, and then I move it to another plant. So that's what we do. And if you don't, there's a few things that deer don't eat. They don't eat spice bush most of the time. But last year we had so many deer, they actually stripped all our spice bush too. So, the deer will eat anything when they're starving.
If you had to choose one or a few keystone plants for a suburban garden, what would you choose?
For a suburban garden or a suburban landscape, if you have room for a tree, I would get an oak on there if you don't have one. And you want to pick the oak that's going to be best for the soil type that you have. I really like the white oak group. It's a little bit better choice now because they don't get the oak leaf scorch the way the red oak group does. So red oaks and pin oaks are getting hammered by oak leaf scorch. If you're talking about herbaceous plants, I would pick the plants that are best at supporting both caterpillars and specialist bees. A third of our North American bees can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. And goldenrod in this part of the country supports at least 12 species of specialist bees. So if you don't have goldenrod, you've lost 12 species from your garden right away. Goldenrod, native asters, perennial sunflowers, all very good at supporting specialist bees. So I'd make sure I had those three in there. You also want to think about what the monarch needs on its migration south. Of course, it needs milkweed to reproduce, but when it's flying all the way down to Mexico, it needs nectar plants. So those fall blooming asters are really important because they bloom really late, and some of those monarchs are flying even early November, and there's nothing for them to eat. So goldenrods in the fall and fall blooming asters are really important for the monarchs.
What are some of your favorite low-growing lawn alternatives for Zone 6A?
Well, I want to reduce the area of lawn, but the lawn you keep is going to be manicured. It's going to be regular lawn. You don't need fertilizer. You don't need any herbicides or anything, but you do need to mow it. So the areas that are not in lawn don't have to be short and something you walk on. They can be anything. Native sedges are great, but there's no sedge that wants to be walked on the way grass does. There's a lot of ground covers, all of your spring ephemerals, your bloodroot and your jack in the pulpit, and violets are great plants. Violets are also really good for specialist bees as well, and they also support all your fritillaries. But don't forget the shrubs, things like witch hazel and native viburnums, chokecherry. If you have wetlands, things like clethra, sweet pepper bush, and the hollies, so inkberry and American holly and Ilex verticillata, what's it called? Winterberry. Those guys can grow in standing water. So can buttonbush. So if you have a wet area, they don't need it, but they can grow. So and they're wonderful butterfly plants. They bloom in the middle of the summer. Virginia creeper, know everybody don't like Virginia creeper, but it's got good fall color and it can be a good ground cover, and it's a wonderful pollinator plant, believe it or not. And it makes lots of good caterpillars, lots of berries for the birds in the fall. Those are some of my favorite plants.
Where can you dispose of the invasive plants once removed?
Okay, that depends on what the plant is. But the typical invasives we have around here, like multiflora rose and autumn olive, and they degrade really quickly. If you pull the porcelain berry out of the trees, it's a big thick vine, but they break down surprisingly fast. So I pile them up in one big pile. In 2 or 3 years, that pile is totally gone. If you're removing something like Japanese knotweed, a little piece of knotweed root the size of your pinky nail will start a new plant. So you have to be much more careful with that stuff. Don't just put it in the garbage can and put it out, because they'll take it away and spread it someplace else. The best thing to do, maybe have a big piece of plastic, put it on the plastic, and let the sun cook it down and kill it. But you have to be careful so that it doesn't go to another area where it can sprout. A story about autumn olive that can be really persistent too. I cut a whole bunch of autumn olive in early summer, one of the early years. And I realized they could be good steaks for the deer cages I was putting up. So I chopped them into steaks and I just left them out the rest of the summer. Then that September, I put up some deer cages and I pounded in those steaks, all of them rooted after being out in the sun all summer long. So you have to be careful with autumn olive, but don't put it in, don't have the garbage man take it away. That'll just spread it.
Have you been able to speak with Home Depot, Lowe's, and the realtors? How do we change the mythology these companies promote?
We talk about that all the time. You don't just walk in the door and talk to Home Depot. You kind of have to be invited. You have to make a relationship. And, now our Homegrown National Park actually has an executive director, Brandon Huff, and he's working on that. So we are trying to get in the door. Those companies want to sell plants, and they're recognizing that there is a market for native plants. They're carrying more of them. They can do a lot better for sure. But, the demand for native plants exceeds the supply. That is a business opportunity. But they need direction. There's no doubt about it. Realtors, they need a lot of direction too. Same thing. We're trying to get in the door for big realtor conferences to get the message that I actually talked to a few just the other day, but they're stubborn to say people don't want this. Well, there's a lot of people that do want it, and there's more and more people that do want it, and they have to understand that. When Cindy and I moved to our new property, the first thing our realtor told us is you have to re-landscape or nobody will buy this house, which wasn't true. They bought it right away, but that's the mindset that we have to overcome. And I do recognize it's an issue.
What's the most simplified version of your data/info that I could share with or present to others to motivate them?
A guy did a magazine article on what we're talking about that I thought was a really good job. And I have it, and I can forward it to you. You got to send me an email and say, send me that. Maybe I can send it to you folks and you can post it or something.
Yeah, if you send it to Jennifer or I, we can push it out to the whole group.
Right, we'll get it out. Yes, indeed.
Right. I will do that. It's probably going to be tomorrow.
Okay.
It's fine.
But it's a really good summary of what we're talking about. So.
Any tips on mugwort? Can you cut and smother the area with thick mulch?
Yeah, mugwort and many of these invasive plants love disturbance. So if you try to get rid of it by disturbing the soil again, it just loosens the seed bank and up they come again. The best thing to depress mugwort is to not disturb it at all. So smothering it with mulch might work. I've never tried that, but planting through it with maybe, if you're trying to make a meadow, it's a huge, huge headache. There's no doubt about it. But if you're putting woodies in there, let it peter itself out. But every time you disturb it, maybe you can cut it without disturbing the roots. That will slow it down. Everybody wants a silver bullet for these invasives. I don't have one. They are terrible. We brought them in, and now we're dealing with the consequences. We can win, but it's a lot of work. There's no doubt about it.
A couple of people are asking for any tips on the spotted lanternfly.
Yes. Wait. Interesting thing happened this year. Spotted lanternfly and myela minute-weed and so many things have come in right around Pennsylvania, right where I live. That seems to be ground zero. We brought spotted lanternfly in because they were eggs on ornamental rocks from China. We have to buy rocks from China because there are no rocks in the US to use as ornaments. So we got the egg masses, and now we got a spotted lanternfly issue. They exploded. By the way, there's no records of spotted lanternfly actually killing a tree. They're on there by the thousands, and it can be, really ugly and troublesome. But they exploded, and then they started to expand, and then the center of this donut of expansion has collapsed. 2 years ago, I had spotted lanternflies every year. Last year, I could hardly find one. and I did nothing. And it wasn't just me, it was all the area around here. The whole population collapsed. Now they're still really numerous as it expands out and out and out, but are they permanently collapsed? I don't know, but something controlled it last year. And I think that's going to happen as you move through this front phase of the invasion. So be patient and see if that happens for you guys as well. You're kind of on the edge of the expansion right now.
A number of people have asked if we'll be sharing this recording, and the library will be putting it on our YouTube page, and we will send a link to everyone who registered for the webinar tonight, so you can watch it again and share it with your friends and family and, you know, people that you know in the community.
And, you know, that is my biggest challenge, is reaching the people who don't want to watch this. They don't know anything about it. They're not interested. So I've always thought when you post this, if each one of you invited a neighbor who would never ever do it on their own, use some you know, friend capital and say, please watch this with me. That would really help get the message to what we call the non-choir. That would be really, really helpful.
And then it looks like the last question, at least so far, is a question about bindweed. Any suggestion for eradicating before planting natives?
Yeah, you know, there's a native bindweed and there's a non-native bindweed. They're both a pain in the neck. They send really deep roots down. Very difficult. You can cut them off and pull up the vine, but they come back from that root eventually. Do I have any suggestions? Not really. Just keep cutting it. If you cut a plant repeatedly, you will exhaust the root system. But by repeatedly, I mean at least once every week, every time it comes back and puts up new green leaves. Bindweed is another pain in the neck.
We're getting a lot of people who are saying thank you for your talk. It's very educational, inspiring. One more question. What is your recommendation for maintenance? Should it be designed for maintenance?
Yeah, you know, all landscapes need to be maintained. There's this misconception that if you plant natives, you never have to do anything again. In the old days, that was more or less true. It would move through succession. But with our invasive plants, that is not true at all. All of our native plantings are constantly invaded, and that's the biggest maintenance headache. Once you have a well-planted landscape, though, and I mean well-planted, you want green mulch, you want so many plants there you can't see the ground. That's going to minimize the weeding opportunities and the opportunities for invasives to come in. But it takes work to get it there, and you have to do a little bit of maintenance every year. It's a lot less than if you have to mow every week, though, once you get it established.
Okay. More people saying thank you.
All right. Well, appreciate the opportunity. I will send you that article tomorrow. And you know what? If I forget, send me an email.
Will
Will
do.
do.
I wrote it down, but my memory's terrible.
Well, Dr. Tallamy, once again, thank you so much for a really inspiring presentation. We truly appreciate it. And we'll follow through and try and get the rest of our community to get on board.
Okay, great. Appreciate that.
Yep.
Good night,
Thank you.
everybody.